Hi, welcome to the Pre-Snow History Hub. This video is all about opposition to the conflict in Vietnam. So, for the duration of the Vietnam War, successive US governments tried to make the public believe that opposition was mainly from young students who had, as they said, dropped out of society. This was an attempt to discredit those people who opposed the war. So, when we say oppose, we mean people who were against it, people that didn't like it. Although some of the protesters were students, there was opposition from different sectors of US society for a variety of reasons. So those reasons include politicians who were against any involvement in Vietnam because of the corrupt nature of the regime in the South, returning US troops who had experienced the horrors of the war firsthand, Black Americans who felt that attaining civil rights for themselves in the USA was more important than the war. Black Americans also suffered from government economic cutbacks caused by the expense of the war. Women of all backgrounds, young, old, black, white. Indeed, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was one of the first movements to protest the war. Some groups were influenced by the general protest movement at the time in the USA and others by events in Vietnam itself. There were three main reasons why people opposed the war. You've got political reasons, US casualties, and media coverage of the war. I'm going to go into more detail about all of these in this video now. So, initial reactions to the war then. Before 1965, there was broad support for US involvement in Vietnam, although some anti-war groups spoke out against it from the start. Once Johnson escalated US military involvement in the period 1965 to 1968, the media and the public quickly became more concerned. Opposition came from every race, class, age, and religious belief. Here are some examples. Martin Luther King criticised the war privately from 1965, and from 1967 he marched and spoke at anti-war protests. On November the 2nd, 1965, Norman Morrison, who was a Quaker, burnt himself to death outside the Pentagon, which is the US military headquarters. He was deliberately copying the Buddhist monk Quang Duc and other monks who had done the same in Vietnam. Wayne Morse, who was a senator for Oregon, spoke out against the war even before 1965. He gave the only speech in the Senate against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And then in 1967, some veterans formed Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They spoke at demonstrations and meetings and handed back their medals. So there are some handy examples that you can use when discussing specific people who were against the Vietnam War. So what were the reasons then for this growth of opposition? So the first reason we're going to look at in detail are political reasons. So some people question the reasoning behind the US involvement in Vietnam. The US government suggested it was a war to protect democracy and freedom against the spread of communism. Yet Diem's regime in South Vietnam was corrupt, undemocratic, and very unpopular. The USA seemed to be fighting to prop up a military dictatorship. The Pentagon Papers of 1971 increased this political opposition. These were a collection of government documents relating to the war in Vietnam. They were leaked to the media and published by the New York Times. They showed how confused the government was over the war and how they had deliberately lied to the public. Political opposition grew in Congress as the war went on, this reflecting changes in public opinion. The Tet Offensive led many who had previously supported the war to change their minds. Those who would push for an end to the war were called doves, and those who were pro-war were known as hawks. Politicians were completely divided on the Vietnam War. Some didn't like the cost of it, so at that time it was costed $167 billion. And some politicians were pacifists, which means they're opposed to all war, they just want peace. Some politicians saw the war as unwinnable. Some were concerned about the effect war was having on international relations. So, for example, growing criticism from other nations and concerns over starting a war with Russia and China. Don't forget that this is all happening within the Cold War context as well. So another reason is Congress. So opposition within Congress was significant. Wars cost money. Presidents have to get Congress to pass laws to raise taxes to fund wars. With Vietnam, this led to lies. Before the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress asked Johnson about the cost of the war if it lasted until 1967. Johnson said $10 billion. The real estimated cost was $20 billion, so double what Johnson had told them. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 led to greater opposition. By June 1970, Congress repealed, which means they took back, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which had once given the president powers without having to consult with Congress. So after June 1970, the president now has to consult with Congress again over decisions involving Vietnam. Congress also set a limit on funding for US troops in Cambodia. It also set a final date for withdrawal of US troops as of the end of 1971. The lack of Congress's support contributed to US defeat in Vietnam. Worldwide opposition. The media reported on Vietnam and civil rights at the same time, though at home and abroad, US police troops were shown using violence against civilians. Americans saw the USA as representing democracy, expecting worldwide respect, but it was a shock to find that many people saw them as supporting a corrupt regime and fighting a war with a shockingly high civilian death toll. There were demonstrations in many countries, and events like My Lai sparked even bigger protests. So, US casualties. Opposition to the war grew with the number of US casualties. In 1965, there were fewer than 2,000 US casualties, but this had increased to 14,000 by 1968. Indeed, in 1967, ex-soldiers formed Vietnam Veterans Against the War, stating that the war was simply not worth the casualties. Media coverage of the war, so it was known as the Living Room War. Television and photography also greatly influenced public opinion. The war in Vietnam was the first to be televised in great detail. Reporters were regularly allowed to travel with the troops into the war zone and were not censored. Moreover, in the mid and late 1960s, colour television became readily accessible, which worsened the bloody nature of what was shown. The conflict was in the living room of most US families. This, together with the photographs, revealed the brutality of the conflict and showed the appalling injuries caused by the use of napalm on civilians, including children. Television also seemed to show that the USA could not win. People also saw news reports of anti-war protests, such as the 100,000-strong protest on the 21st of October 1967 in Washington. It was becoming clear that the government was keeping information from the public and lying to them. For example, My Lai in 1968, the government claimed the Tet Offensive was a success, but CBS television news reporter Walter Cronkite, who was very well respected at the time, came back from Vietnam and told the public that it was at best a stalemate, that the war looked unwinnable. Many Americans believed Cronkite, not their government. And the US methods of warfare also led to a growth in opposition. So the methods of warfare used by the USA also brought about much opposition. Chemical warfare angered environmentalists because of the damage it did to the jungle in Vietnam, as well as to civilians. The US saw bombing from the air as brutal and unnecessary. Many were appalled by the suffering caused by the search and destroy missions. So, the Great Society. Some people opposed the war because the conflict undermined President Johnson's attempt to improve the country through what he called the Great Society, which was a series of reforms designed to reduce unemployment and improve medical services and education. However, they were not fully carried out, as resources were diverted to the war in Vietnam. The war was costing $20 billion a year, and the concept of the Great Society was pushed to one side. How was public opinion measured on Vietnam? Public opinion on Vietnam can be measured in three ways. So the first way is opinion polls. These can show both expected and unexpected opinions. The most regularly used were Gallup polls. In August 1965, a Gallup poll of 3,625 people of all ages and sexes across the USA were asked about Vietnam. The poll showed that 187 people favoured sending more troops and invading the north, but 3,338 were against this. 1,179 people would be more inclined to vote for a politician who would push for peace negotiations, whereas 1,336 would be less likely to do this. When given the age range of 17 to over 26, most people said 20-year-olds should be drafted for Vietnam first. Politicians, so who tended to react when an issue is significant enough to affect votes. As a result, their views might be a useful measure of public opinion. And then finally, demonstrations. So their size, who took part in them, and any specific issues they targeted show public opinion towards the war. Counter demonstration, so a demonstration held to show opposition to a demonstration taking place at the same time, can also be a useful measure of public opinion. Anti-war slogans also started to appear, things like 18 today, dead tomorrow. In August 1968, 10,000 demonstrators went to Chicago to the Democratic Party convention to protest against the war. Police used violence to break them up. In November 68, 35,000 people protested outside the White House. And in 68, Nixon became president and he promised to bring an end to the war. So images like this were seen where the chief of police in Saigon executes a Viet Cong suspect in 68. That happened live on TV. And children fleeing a napalm attack, also shown live on TV, was really, really shocking to people at the time. Also, in popular culture, anti-war songs became bestsellers. For example, Blowing in the Wind by Bob Dylan and Imagine and Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon. So what were protest groups in the USA and what did they do? So you had the civil rights movement first. It was the movement for equal rights for Black US citizens, led by Martin Luther King. It had a lot of support from Black and white students. They used a range of methods to achieve their aims, including marches and sit-ins. Protesters against Vietnam later adopted the same methods in their demonstrations. Many Black youths also supported the anti-war movement. This is because the proportion of Black people conscripted into the Vietnam War was much higher than that of the white population. Seen as another example of the racist policies of the US government. A high-profile opponent of the draft was Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, who was stripped of his title for refusing to fight in Vietnam. He said, "I'm a black person, the Vietnamese are brown people, we do not have anything against each other." There was the student movement, though many young Americans were unhappy with the older generation and thought they were out of touch with the issues of the day. In 1950, there were just 2.2 million students in the USA. This rose to 5.9 million by 65 and 8.5 million by 1970. These students became part of what was known as a counterculture movement in US society. Students started to protest against the government for changes, such as better rights for Black citizens. A lot of students felt that the Vietnam War was another example of the government's abuse of power and wanted to make a stand against the conflict. Protest singers such as Bob Dylan became very popular with students who saw these artists as expressing their own views about society at the time. One of Dylan's most famous songs, Blowing in the Wind, was a protest song about the hypocrisy of war. Students refused to go to classes and burnt their draft cards. As time went on, student protests became much bigger and much more organised, prompting much media attention. And finally, Students for a Democratic Society, known as the SDS. This was set up in 1960, and by 65 it had 3,000 members and groups on over 80 US college campuses. SDS and other radical groups angered many people by not only opposing the war, but also supporting the North Vietnamese. Some carried banners with pictures of communists such as the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Slogans were shouted such as, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" referring to President Johnson. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snow History Hub. The next video is going to be all about the draft.